Welcome to Human Monsters. Theresa Jimmy Francine Knorr was born on March 14th, 1946, in Sacramento, California. She was the youngest of two daughters born to Swanee Gay and James Jim Cross. Swanee had a son and daughter from a previous marriage. Jim worked at a local dairy products manufacturer as a cheesemaker. He was eventually able to save up enough money to buy a house in Rio Linda. In the late 1950s, he was forced out of his job by complications of Parkinson's disease. He became depressed and resentful, and his wife and family bore the brunt of his angry outbursts. Swanee became the primary breadwinner. Theresa was very close to her mother, who died in her arms on March 2nd, 1961, an event from which Theresa never fully recovered. In fact, with her father unable to work, he was left with no recourse but to sell the house. September 29th, 1962. At the age of 16, Theresa married 21-year-old Clifford Clyde Sanders. They had been dating for less than a year. She was so eager to drop out of school and get her adult life off the ground that she not only married him, but gave birth to their first child, a son named Howard Clyde Sanders, on July 16, 1963. The marriage was not without its problems. For one thing, Theresa was possessive and paranoid, often accusing Clifford of being unfaithful. They fought on a regular basis. She alleged that on June 22, 1964, that he had punched her in the face during one of their arguments. She reported the incident to police, but refused to press charges. They got into another epic fight on July 6, 1964, because he chose to celebrate his birthday out with friends rather than at a home with his family. Supposedly, he told her amid their dispute that he intended to leave her. July 6, 1964, 9:15 a.m. Sheriff's Deputy Fred May received a visit from a citizen of the town of Galt. It was Theresa Sanders. She was all business. She said, "You gotta come quick. I shot my husband in the arm." Fred May and Police Chief Walter Freilich accompanied Theresa back to her home. She had her baby with her. When they entered the Sanders domicile, they found Clifford lying face down in the doorway at the front of the house. He did have a gunshot wound in his wrist. However, the bullet's trajectory took it through her husband's body and didn't stop there. It wound up in his heart and turned his lights out immediately. The officers spotted a deer rifle leaning against a wall in the front room. Noting their interest, Theresa said, "I grabbed the gun to make him keep from hitting me, and it went off." She told them that Clifford had been beating her with the butt of the rifle, and that she reported him for domestic assault but did not press charges. Reflecting on her disposition at the time, 30 years later, Freilich said, "Her reaction was mild, I'd say, but different people react in different ways." Theresa was booked and taken to a county jail. Baby Howard was sent to relatives. She said to Deputy District Attorney Donald Duffman, "I remember holding the gun and having my finger on the trigger, but then everything went blank." James Cross didn't exactly help her cause when he pointed out that the rifle was normally loaded with the safety on, and that she would have had to deliberately prep the gun for use. In other words, it was a premeditated crime requiring strategic thinking. Directed entirely by her id, She could not have done so impulsively with a gun that was primed to resist a wanton and thoughtless discharge. Though Howard was only 11 months old at the time of the shooting, living with the knowledge that his mother murdered his father was difficult for him to contend with throughout the years. At the time she was arrested, Theresa was pregnant with a daughter, whose name was to be Sheila. August 4th, 1964. Theresa made her first court appearance. She submitted a plea of innocent by reason of self-defense. She insisted that her intention was only to scare him. She whipped up some tears to convince the judge of her sincerity. She did the same with her lawyers, saying, "All I want to do is go home and take care of my baby." Prosecutor Donald Dorfman was not sympathetic. He pitched a first-degree conviction, stating that she was jealous about her husband's interactions with other women, something of which she had never seen evidence. He said to the jury, "Not every murderer looks like the witch in Snow White." Furthermore, he reported that she ran across the street immediately after the murder and told a neighbor friend, "No man's going to leave me." The judge deemed that last article of evidence as inadmissible since she said it to the wife of the sheriff's deputy, and she was not read her Miranda rights in the process of doing so. 2 bailiffs were assigned to ensure Theresa's protection, since one of Clifford's brothers said he was, quote, "going to get a gun and shoot someone." At one point, the judge permitted Theresa's attorney to possess a firearm in court. Her lawyer didn't exactly ingratiate himself to Clifford's family when he declared in the courtroom, "None of you maniacs are going to get me like Cliff tried to get her." Clifford's sister Lydia painted a very different portrait of her brother. According to her, he worked hard, never drank alcohol, and submitted all his earnings to Theresa. She also said that he never struck or even so much as threatened Theresa. She noted the many ways in which Theresa's possessiveness would manifest, like giving him only 50 cents for lunch so that there was no chance he would go to a restaurant and meet other women. She would also damage his clothing to the point that he was wearing rags so that other women would find his unkempt appearance unappealing. Lydia also pointed out that Theresa once shot at Clifford and missed. He even showed Lydia the bullet hole. She concluded by saying, "I believe with all my heart that Theresa Sanders planned to kill my brother." However, she went on to say that Theresa should be released so that she could take care of her children. That last appeal seems to have worked, for the jury found her not guilty as charged. That, after deliberating after only an hour and 45 minutes, she thanked them tearfully. Soon after, she visited Dorfman's office to retrieve the rifle with which she shot her husband. Unable to move back into the house where she killed her husband, Theresa and her children relocated to Rio Linda. March 13th, 1965. Sheila Gay Sanders was born a day before her mother's birthday. At the closing of 1966, Theresa began dating again when she met Marine Robert Wallace Knorr. By then she moved to San Francisco. That year she gave birth to her third child, Susan Marlene Knorr, on September 27th. His family wasn't exactly thrilled. Theresa was 2 years his senior, and they were not married. They eventually caved in to the pressure and married late that year. September 15th, 1967. The couple's son, William Robert, was born. December 31st, 1968. Robert Wallace Jr. was born. Robert Knorr was a highly volatile and abusive presence in the home. Not only did he have a fearsome temper by nature, but complications of PTSD as an outcrop of his experiences in the Vietnam War also led to abuse. It got to the point where the children dreaded his arrival every day and gave him a wide berth. On one occasion, Howard went to pick up his brother Robert from the floor, whereupon Robert Sr. kicked the baby so hard he flew into a toilet, with his head being split open in the process. Theresa's sixth child, Terry, was born on August 5th, 1970. By then, Theresa was separated from Robert. Their divorce was finalized later that year. Her next marriage was to a man named Ronald Pulliam. He was remembered more fondly by her children. They even began addressing him as Dad. This time it was Theresa who dished out the abuse. In fact, years later he refused to even discuss her. He was so put off by the way he was treated. Theresa and her children moved to Orangevale, where they would live longer than in any of the previous homes. Things were truly looking up. Theresa met Chester Harris, a wealthy newspaper executive who worked on a publication called the Sacramento Union, which is no longer in print. At the time, Theresa put on weight and grew her long black hair down to Macbethian proportions. Speaking of witchcraft, Chester was involved with the occult, and Theresa became his protege. Theresa Knorr started out as a very good parent. She was the one person the children could rely upon to love and support them. She would make sacrifices for her children, even going as far as to pawn a diamond ring to buy school clothes for her daughter. As far as her own self-development, she read the Bible obsessively and even forced the children to join her in Bible readings. She gave them a soft place to land after Robert Knorr Sr. abused them. Something emerged later that would cast a pall over the single-parent family after the departure of Robert Knorr Sr. It turned out that 6-year-old Terry was being molested by 13-year-old Howard. As Terry related to investigators years later, "I didn't know what he was doing. Well, I knew what he was doing wasn't right, but I wasn't, I was afraid to tell anybody, and I went to my mom because it hurt." Theresa punished Robert Jr. in the only way she knew how: corporal punishment. She broke a chair over his back and continued to thrash him until the point was well taken. Howard admitted in 1993 that he sexually abused his sister. He was interviewed by investigators on November 16th. From their exchange, "I'm going to make this very short and sweet. There's been allegations of molestation and that you molested Theresa, your sister. Are those allegations true?" "Yes." "And that was sodomy, anal sex?" "Yes." Terry has stated on record that when the molestation came to light, it was the tipping point when the family descended into full-scale dysfunction. A friend of Theresa's stopped by to offer her some of her children's hand-me-downs. This infuriated Theresa, as she assumed her children were telling everybody they knew that they were poor. She assumed that Terry was the instigator of it all. The punishment: she forced Terry to disrobe, leaving her stark naked. She paraded her throughout the house that way. As if this humiliation weren't enough, she piled on the torture by taking a rope, tying it around Terry's neck, and throwing it over a door. Theresa forced Billy Bob and Robert to hold Terry in place while Theresa beat her with a switch until Terry nearly fainted from the pain. Theresa's violent outbursts appeared to coincide with her budding interest in witchcraft. From there, she claimed her daughter Susan was a Satanist. She concluded that Susan conspired to kill her before the age of 18. As Theresa put it, to fulfill her contract with the devil. After Theresa separated from Chester, she would frequently disappear from the house for days at a time. 14-year-old Howard was left to hold down the fort, the worst possible choice to be deputized in that role. On one such occasion, she went missing for 4 days and was escorted back home by the police. She claimed that Howard had threatened her. Howard cried because he had never felt so betrayed by his mother, to be falsely accused and abandoned by her. Clearly, this woman had a screw loose. Howard asked her where she had been during those 4 days. To quote Howard, "She told me she had found some pennies, and she threw these pennies away, and that, these pennies showed back up in the motel where she was staying, and no matter what she did, these pennies kept showing back up, I didn't understand it at the time, but looking back on it, obviously they were paranoid delusions, and that goes along with somebody that's having a nervous breakdown." Theresa became deeply depressed to the point where she became disinclined to get out of bed and getting properly dressed. She refused to bathe. She became a recluse, staying indoors for weeks at a time. Most of her social interactions were with her kids, and most of those consisted of abuse. The last time she beat Howard, it was with a 2x4 on which she scrawled the words, "Board of Destruction." He said, "You done now?" She said, "Yes, I guess you're too big to whip anymore." Howard has said that these interactions resulted in him developing a nasty temper. As he noted, "I had a real problem with my anger, real problem with my anger. That's what led me into a bad marriage, and I ended up going to jail for it. And that wasn't the first time I ever got in trouble about violence. So yeah, it screwed me up pretty good. I had a lot of demons to work out." Theresa did not extend any mercy to her daughters. In fact, she resented them for being younger and prettier. She was worried they would become promiscuous. In her effort to prevent this, she would not allow them to socialize with other teenagers when they were not at school. Howard was struggling to accept being forced into a paternal role looking after his siblings while working a part-time job and going to school. Fortunately, the other children accepted him as an authority figure. They didn't have a choice. He would wield the board of destruction. Theresa would continue to abuse the other children, hitting them with switches and beating them black and blue with her fists. Eventually, as Howard spent more and more time in the real world, he came to realize that the abuse he inflicted on his siblings was wrong. He would refrain from doing so and even stood up to Theresa. He found it increasingly difficult not to hit her. On one occasion, he threw her against a wall. Susan and Sheila were most frequently abused by Theresa. At its most insane and diabolical, she yanked out Sheila's canine tooth because she felt it wasn't growing straight. Sheila had big ears and was taunted at school by kids who called her Dumbo. Bullied at school and abused at home. The torture was never ending. Theresa became a heavy drinker. She would often load all 6 kids in the station wagon and park it outside of bars as she poisoned herself. The last thing that crazy bitch needed was alcohol. As Howard recalled, she'd end up getting bombed. She'd pass out, and we'd have to wait for her to wake up to go home. The children were forced to eat nutritionally bankrupt food high in saturated fats. Sometimes teachers would take pity on them and give them sandwiches or even a hot meal. By the time he turned 12, Howard was smoking cigarettes, drinking alcohol, and taking drugs, all on a daily basis, all with Theresa's consent. That and a slice of bread with peanut butter and jelly or cheese. Another quote attributed to Howard: "If my mother loved you, she loved you greatly. But if you were on the outs with my mother, she would make you feel like you were all alone in the universe, that nobody cared about you, and you weren't worth anything. So, you always wanted to be on the good side of my mother." People who visited the Knorr household at that time noted that there were no efforts to conceal the dysfunction. Everybody in the home drank alcohol, did drugs, and the matriarch beat the children savagely. The Knorr children often complained that they were not fed properly at home, and neighbors often gave them meals. The misery of her home life led Susan to run away on many occasions. The fact that Howard started sexually abusing her only made life in the Knorr household worse. Even Howard would spend as little time as possible at home because being an authority figure did not make life more pleasant under his mother's rule. At one point, Susan ran away yet again at the age of 15, and she was arrested. She reported all the abuse she experienced at home. CPS visited the Knorr residence. They concluded that Susan's story of abuse, neglect, and dysfunction was pure fiction, and she was left with her mother. Terry was forced to lie to CPS officials or else face a vicious beating by her mother. One night, Susan snuck into Theresa's room and cut her hair, her nails, and shaved her eyebrows off. She had placed sleeping tablets in her coffee to ensure she would not wake. Theresa tortured the other children into confessing who the guilty party was by burning them with cigarettes. Eventually, one of them admitted it was Susan. Theresa wasn't surprised. She suspected Susan was jealous of her beauty. Hence began a campaign of revenge against Susan. At its most innocuous, she accused her of having a sexually transmitted disease. She said to Howard's girlfriend, Connie, "She is a witch, and the only way you can kill a witch is by burning them." She also warned Connie that if ever she were to leave behind strands of hair or trimmed fingernails, she should dispose of them immediately because Susan might use the materials for her Satan-worshipping ceremonies. She even warned her that Susan would come to her for blood at some point. Theresa would often force Susan to read scripture, and she even contacted priests to see whether an exorcism could be performed on her. She would try to discourage the children from attending school as a means of preventing the elder girls from sleeping around. Sheila, Susan, and Terry all dropped out eventually. One day, while doling out the punishment, Theresa displayed a handgun. She lifted the gun and pointed it at Susan. She fired, and the bullet entered the area underneath Susan's left breast and straight through her rib cage before becoming lodged in her back. Susan clutched her chest as she stumbled backwards into the bathroom, landing on the lip of the bathtub. Theresa tried to remove Susan's clothes. She draped her over the bathtub. She was anxious to have a close look at the bullet hole. Later that night, Theresa made Terry and Sheila scrub Susan's blood from the floor and the door frame. They also washed the blood from the bathroom floor and the bathtub. Theresa forced them to do it by implication. They knew she would lash out at them with brute violence if they hadn't. She made them clean the house and do gardening for hours on end on a regular basis. It wasn't unusual for the kids to be cleaning the house until 3 o'clock in the morning. They had become indentured servants, toiling at hard manual labor like slaves. Indeed, they were unpaid and faced physical torture as a consequence for gold bricking and shoddy workmanship. Following the shooting of Susan, Theresa said to her long-suffering children, "Just keep your mouths shut. If we have to get rid of the body, we will." Was she planning on keeping the body in the house so they could live like Norman Bates? Terry wanted to report the shooting to the police, but having witnessed an incident that proved to her that her mother would kill her if she reported the incident to the authorities, resulted in her keeping that dark secret. Susan was still alive, and her siblings would go into the bathroom and stare at her. Sheila would stop and talk to her. She confided in her that she had contemplated suicide on occasion. Theresa overheard this conversation and handed Sheila the gun. She said to her, "If you're so depressed, then kill yourself." Sadly, this idea was as appealing to Sheila as it was to Theresa. Sheila went to her room with a gun. She pulled the trigger, but it turned out the gun was unloaded. Susan was left in the bathroom, which became a prison cell of sorts for her. She had lost a lot of blood, but gradually regained her strength through the subsequent weeks. Strangely, Theresa began to wait on Susan and do what she could to heal her injuries. She had been a nurse, and she provided antibiotics, painkillers, and wound care. Theresa had pilfered medications and other medical supplies from the hospitals where she had worked. She still refused to let Susan out of the tub. The other children were not permitted to use that bathroom. Theresa would tell them they might catch a disease from Susan. At one point, Theresa apologized to Susan and asked for her forgiveness. Susan told her that she would forgive her. Eventually, Susan was allowed out of the tub. Ultimately, Theresa not only wanted to avoid disclosure of the shooting to outsiders, but she also wanted to present a facade of a well-adjusted, functional family, something at which she did not excel, though she could lie when she had to. By that point, Howard was 20 years old and had moved out of Theresa's house, the best thing he did to preserve his sanity. Theresa told him about the shooting, claiming it was done in retaliation for Susan's actions, which consisted of stabbing Sheila with a steak knife. Frightened of the potential consequence for failing to do so, Sheila backed up Theresa's story when she spoke with Howard. In fact, all the children would reinforce Theresa's lies. Theresa went on to tell Howard that a few days after the stabbing, Sheila shot Susan. She reassured him by telling him it was a surface wound and easily treated. Subsequent to the shooting, Susan would avoid going home as much as possible. She would stay at friends' homes or simply walk the streets until late at night. It was a risky thing for a young woman to do, but she wasn't much safer at home. The house was put up for sale shortly after the shooting, and it was purchased by Howard and his common-law wife, Connie. Connie, like Theresa's children, was also afraid of Theresa. One night, while she and Howard were at home together, Connie heard a ruckus in the hallway. When she investigated the cause of the noise, she found Theresa Knorr emptying a closet. Theresa turned to Connie and said, cryptically, "I know what you are. I know what you're doing. You will be punished. Your time will come." Connie was asking for it as far as Theresa was concerned, though she would not state explicitly what it was. She was younger than Theresa, prettier than Theresa, and had lured Howard into adulthood, whereupon he spent more time with her. Speculation had it that that was exactly what offended Theresa so much. Not surprisingly, Connie made sure to avoid Theresa as much as possible from that point onwards. Weeks later, Connie was pregnant with Howard's first child. Theresa paid a visit to Connie's mother's home. She told her that Susan said the baby was a boy and would be born on February 1st, and he would present with some sort of birth defect. Chillingly, these predictions came true. Theresa chalked this precision of prophecy to Susan's alleged pact with the devil, which, according to Theresa, had given her magic powers, including clairvoyance. It's too bad the devil didn't exist and couldn't bestow upon Susan some real magic powers, like the ability to shoot force lightning out of her hands like a Star Wars villain, or dispatch someone into unconsciousness by using the Vulcan nerve pinch, as seen in Star Trek. Theresa told Connie that Susan was going to kill her to ensure that the family name would not be perpetuated. I guess she wasn't aware that Knorr is a major international food brand. Connie was even more scared now. This family was dangerous. They operated like a cult, even if the children were only following orders. Still, Theresa Knorr was as insane and controlling as any cult leader you can name. The family moved to a rented home. Theresa was not finished torturing Susan. She purchased a pair of handcuffs to place on her wrists. She would place socks on her wrists first, so the cuffs didn't leave scars. This did not work as she'd hoped, so she bought canvas wrist restraints. She would also blindfold her on the regular. She feared Susan as she still believed she was riding shotgun with the devil. She also was taking these measures to prevent her from reporting the abuse to CPS. The house was frequently devoid of food. Theresa made her sons beat Susan if she ever disobeyed her. With the combination of frequent abuse and neglect, Susan's physical appearance changed. She was pale and gaunt. Theresa attributed it to devil worship. At night, Theresa handcuffed Susan to her bed and gave her tranquilizers to ensure she would not stir throughout the night. Coincidentally, perhaps, Susan began speaking in her sleep and verbalizing other sounds. Theresa developed a theory that Susan wanted to kill Sheila because she was a virgin and therefore ideal for a human sacrifice. She was also convinced that Susan's pact with the devil resulted in her own illnesses. Susan was banned by her mother from using the same toilet as everybody else in the house due to Theresa's fear that everybody would catch a venereal disease from her. There was only one toilet in the house. God only knows what that circumstance led to. If I had the details, I would share them with you because that's the Humo way. The constant torture and lack of food sapped Susan of her strength, and over time, her body deteriorated. She was remembered as being zombie-like at one point, walking and speaking with the minimum of effort, since that's all she could summon from her limited reserves of energy. Oh, and Theresa demanded that when they occupy the kitchen at the same time as Susan, she must stand with her back to them. At one point, Theresa stabbed Susan with a pair of scissors. Later, after admiring her effort, she pulled the scissors out of Susan's back and treated the wound. Following this, Susan was ordered to return to her bedroom, where she was cuffed and blindfolded. A few weeks later, Theresa forced Susan down to the floor and stood on her neck. Susan struggled to remain conscious as Theresa obstructed her breathing. At one point, Susan began to go into convulsions. Surely a death rattle was imminent. But at the last minute, Theresa withdrew, sparing herself an awkward conversation with the police. Sadly, after marrying Connie, Howard would emulate his mother, becoming controlling and abusive to Connie. He even spent a year in prison for one assault. Connie even noted that Howard beat their infant son. He was selling narcotics to make ends meet, which was yet another aspect of his mother's influence, as she collaborated with him on his trafficking operation. In 1990, he was arrested after threatening to hire a hitman to kill his wife. He was a chip off the old block. Years later, when Terry was asked by investigators what would have happened if Susan had left the house permanently, Terry said, "Susan would have ended up dead." Theresa, being the crazy-ass bitch that she is, decided that she was qualified to remove the bullet from Susan's back. She laid her down on the floor and placed a pillow underneath her. She gave her liquor and painkillers to ensure endurance. Billy, Bob, and Robert were ordered to hold Susan down when necessary. Theresa put on surgical gloves and took up a scalpel and a pair of pincers. If you have a background in medicine and or surgery, you're probably listing all the prep work that was not done. It took hours for Theresa to remove the bullet. In the meantime, Susan lost vast quantities of blood. Theresa held on to the bullet, keeping it from her children, who could have taken it to the police, who could have run ballistics on it. The next day, Susan woke up face down on the kitchen floor. Everybody else tiptoed around her as they went about their business in the kitchen. Theresa wouldn't let the other kids bring Susan to the bathroom. Instead, they had to place diapers under her pelvis and change them whenever the stench was unbearable. Theresa kept pumping Susan full of antibiotics to stave off infection, a common side effect of amateur surgery. Regardless, Susan began to deteriorate within a week. She became so weak that her brain was oxygen deprived to the point where she began to hallucinate. She thought her brother was her grandfather. At one point, she said to Terry, "I can see my life passing before my eyes." Soon after, she developed lockjaw. Reflecting on this years later, Terry said, "She was dying. I just know. It was like a movie, you know?" Sheila was so alarmed by this state of affairs that she summoned the nerve to confront her mother. She said, "Susan's dying. We got to do something." Theresa said, "What do you want me to do about it? I've tried to help her. There's nothing more I can do." Theresa would eventually admit that Susan needed real medical attention, but she forbade it for fear that she would be found out and arrested for shooting her daughter. Theresa decided to check to see if Susan was still alive. Her method of doing this was to kick her and listen for a moan. Speaking like a true narcissist, she said, "She needs a doctor. She needs to go to a hospital. But if I take her to a hospital, she's been beaten so badly that I'm going to go to jail. We can't do that." She instructed the children to keep watch over Susan throughout the night. July 12, 1982. Theresa walked into the children's bedroom. She sat down on one of the bunk beds to discuss what to do with Susan, who was still lying on the kitchen floor, only by this time her wound had become critically infected. The wound became inflamed and a red coloration had developed. Because she had not been taken to hospital, there was real danger of the wound becoming necrotic, leading to a horrific death. Susan's eyes had turned yellow, reminiscent of jaundice. Theresa believed they were yellow because of her allegiance to the devil. Terry noticed that Susan's ribs protruded from her torso to the point that she was downright skeletal. There were hundreds of black marks on her back, perhaps necrotic as her body was shutting down. Susan was wearing nothing but a diaper, and it was too small. July 15th, Theresa declared her intentions to finish Susan off to her children. She placed all of Susan's personal belongings on the ground in back of the house and set them all on fire. Theresa filled their car with gas before embarking on Susan's final journey. By then, Susan was barely conscious, muttering to no one in particular incoherent missives. Before they took her out of the car, Terry knelt to Susan and said, "I love you." Susan was so weakened she was unable to walk, so Robert and William had to drag her to the car. Once in the car, she didn't even have the strength to keep herself erect. She slouched over onto her siblings throughout the commute. Theresa postponed Susan's execution at the last minute. Susan was brought back home and returned to the kitchen floor. Even vermin enjoyed more dignity than Susan at that time. Terry would shake and prod Susan to see if she was still alive. After having done so for a minute, Susan would begin babbling gibberish. It was as if she were reduced to infancy. Theresa and her children drove to an isolated spot with Susan in tow. Having brought the remainder of her belongings with them, they placed them in a pile. They placed Susan on top of it. They allowed her enough dignity to wear a jumpsuit instead of just a diaper. Billy drenched Susan with gasoline. Theresa walked back to the car. She observed as Billy lit a match and set his sister on fire. Once Billy was back in the car, Theresa said to him, "If you ever tell anybody about this, you're going to be next." February 17th, 1985. Sheila had become a prostitute. Theresa was not only aware, but put pressure on her to continue turning tricks. Yes, the same woman who fretted over the possibility that her daughters could become promiscuous was now profiting from Sheila's nightly take. One day Sheila was cycling to the store to buy cigarettes for Theresa. While en route, she was hit by a car and taken to hospital. Theresa was concerned about this state of affairs, though it had nothing to do with maternal empathy. She was afraid that the incident was no accident, that it was a sign from God that Sheila was influenced by the devil. She was hit in front of a mortuary, which is what led to Theresa's theory. That, however, would be the least of Sheila's worries at the time. With her theory that Sheila was possessed came another belief, this being that Sheila was pregnant. There was no proof, no baby bump, but Theresa apparently didn't need such evidence. As soon as Sheila walked back into the house, Billy Bob and Robert restrained her. As they did so, Theresa dished out a brutal beating and strangled her. According to Terry, the tortures would occasionally venture into bizarre territory. Like she had once done to Susan, Theresa forced Sheila to eat copious amounts of macaroni and cheese. She broke one of her front teeth out as she force-fed it to her. She stuffed so much of the mac and cheese down her throat that Sheila became nauseous and vomited it back up. By this point, Sheila was black and blue all over. Theresa was the Mike Tyson of psychotic, abusive mothers. And by that I mean the bitch could throw a punch. She was anxious to prevent outsiders from seeing the bruises and scars on Sheila's body, so she made her get into the bathtub. She filled it with cold water and ice cubes. She made her stay in the tub for about an hour. Like Susan before her, Sheila was now handcuffed at night, though her mother cuffed her underneath the kitchen table. They were the same cuffs she used on Susan. Billy Bob declared his intentions to move out into an apartment with his girlfriend, Emily Lewis. He was so determined to get out of Theresa's house that he took 3 jobs to afford the rent in the apartment. Sheila was dispatched in the company of Robert and Billy Bob to visit a doctor to find out if she was pregnant. The doctor diagnosed her as without child. Though this was settled in Theresa's mind, she was convinced that Sheila had a venereal disease. Sheila was sent to another doctor, this time to be tested for chlamydia and pelvic inflammatory disease. Theresa was convinced that she was catching diseases from Sheila and would combat them with penicillin. She would tell the other children that Sheila not only had VD, but obtained an antidote that she refused to share with her mother. Theresa could not be dissuaded that this was untrue, and she was so furious with Sheila that she hogtied her in a closet as punishment for what Theresa perceived as deception. Furthermore, Theresa severely rationed the food she fed to Sheila and refused to liberate her from the closet. May 1985. By the end of this month, Theresa refused to feed anything to Sheila. Her limbs were restrained with medical supplies, like ace bandages. Theresa rigged the doorknob so that the door could only be opened from the outside. Theresa told Sheila that not only would she not feed her, but she wouldn't even so much as give her a glass of water until she admitted what she had done. As Terry put it, she wanted Sheila to confess. That was Mother's way. Beat them until they confess. Starving, thirsty, and choking on her BO due to perspiring endlessly from the heat in the closet, Sheila made the false confession to Theresa in hopes that she would elicit some mercy from her. She told her that she had contracted an STD and that she had the cure. Those factoids were only a product of her mother's delusions, but Sheila did what she had to do. Finally, after a week in solitary, Sheila was released. Theresa was unexpectedly nurturing, helping Sheila ingest some water. Theresa then went on to ask Sheila what drugs the doctor had given her to combat VD. Given her inexperience with sexually transmitted diseases, it only made sense that Sheila lacked the medical trivia to tell a credible lie. She stammered as she answered this question, and Theresa knew she was lying to her. She took her back to the closet and locked her inside once again. As Sheila screamed and begged to be released, everybody ignored her. It got to the point where her desperate pleas just became white noise, something to tune out. Theresa would place towels underneath the door to muffle the sound as much as possible. Her pleas for help became part of the humdrum reality of everyday existence in that house. Terry was the only member of the family to extend some compassion towards Sheila. One day when Theresa went out to the store, Terry opened the closet and gave Sheila 2 cans of beer. Sheila's hair was soaked to her scalp and shoulders. It was like a sauna in there. The last thing Terry heard Sheila say to her was, "There is a light above me. I think it's a hole. I'm going to climb toward it." Moments later, Terry heard a thump, then another, and then a deathly silence. Not the kind of silence that brings relief. If the fear of the unknown had a motion picture soundtrack, it would be silent, like a pregnant pause. There were solid pine shelves in the closet, and Sheila attempted to climb them. The shelves collapsed under her weight, and she went tumbling down to the floor. For 3 days, Theresa and her kids listened for more sound within the closet. There was a very good chance that the closet had become Sheila's coffin. June 21st, 1985. Theresa summoned Billy Bob by having Robert cycle over to his apartment. Flanked by her sons, Theresa opened the closet door. The stench of decay wafted up into their nasal cavities. Theresa declared that Sheila was dead. She had now murdered 2 of her own children. There was dried blood on Sheila's face. There was a puddle of blood around her face on the floor. Her torso was nearly bare. She was curled up into the fetal position with her arms behind her back. Eager to avoid attention from the authorities, Theresa decided that one way to make Sheila's corpse less identifiable was to prevent dental records from being examined. She proposed to ensure this by taking a hammer and smashing out all of Sheila's teeth. Billy Bob and Robert struggled to transfer Sheila to the hallway because her face was stuck to the bloody spot on the floor. The boys put Sheila's remains in a box, duct-taped it, and they accompanied Theresa as she drove off to find a place to bury the box. They were about to bury it, but a pedestrian showed up, so they abandoned the box adjacent to some bushes. Theresa decided not to burn the body because she didn't want Sheila's death to be similar to that of Susan's. She figured that similarities of execution and disposal would make it appear that a serial killer was responsible, and patterns make investigations easier. Theresa hated her own daughters so much that it seems like it was inevitable that Terry would become her next victim, and she did. As a friend of Robert's recalled regarding an occasion when he visited their house, "As I walked up to the front door, I heard the mother beating Terry with a stick, and I could hear other screams coming from the back of the house. Suddenly, Robert freaked out completely and said I had to leave. My mom's freaking out," was all he would say. He was a very pale white color and seemed very shocked and upset. Terry was the latest female in the family to find herself in handcuffs, the same pair as if they were heirlooms by that point. During one incident of abuse, Terry was cuffed to a desk and Theresa jumped up and down on her. She crushed Terry's stomach, and the damage to Terry's reproductive organs was irreparable. She was rendered incapable of bearing a child. September 29th, 1986, 3:40 a.m. Theresa had devised a plan for her and the kids to burn down the house. Theresa's reasoning was that though they scrubbed down the closet that held Sheila's remains diligently, a tidal wave of bleach would not have been enough. Nothing cleanses like fire. She was also concerned that if the unit they occupied were to house someone else in the future, the occupants would find the bloodstains. It was Terry who was made to douse the house's interior with lighter fluid and set it alight. Moments later, she reunited with Theresa and Robert at a motel. A fire official investigated the scene after the fire and concluded that it was deliberately set. Terry's life didn't improve much. She was cooped up in a sweltering closet, but following in her deceased sister's footsteps, she was now a prostitute. Whatever her expectations were, when she had a brief reunion with her father, it didn't result in him rescuing her from her mother's madhouse. He molested Terry, and that was about all he contributed to her life at that point. She was 16 years old. She carried Susan's driver's license, which stated an age of 21. Explaining this, Terry said, "I got that so I could be with the older crowd and not be caught for being so young. The people I was living with at the time were basically hiding me out from my mother and my family." Considering what Theresa had done to Susan and Sheila, it was literally a matter of life and death. Another reason was that she could gain admittance to local bars where she could meet tricks. Theresa Knorr and her son Robert moved to Reno, Nevada. The city has been dubbed life's garbage can because of the fact that so many drifters and ne'er-do-wells from California migrate there after their lives have crash-landed. Theresa had altered her appearance by dyeing her hair blonde, and her voice was often drowned out by slot machines. So for someone on the lam looking for a fresh start, she could have done a lot worse. Soon Robert became seduced by the gutter and fell in with local lowlife. He even ran afoul of the law. The police showed up at their home one day. This terrified Theresa, as the last thing she wanted was to have the authorities at her door for any reason after killing 2 of her own children. She decided to move to Salt Lake City. Whether Theresa won any money in the casinos or not, she got a lucky break when a man was falsely accused of murdering 10 women, including Sheila, as part of a killing spree called the Body in the Box case. Supposedly, there was a DNA match between samples of carpet fibers. Meanwhile, the only person willing to report Theresa to the authorities, Terry Knorr, disclosed what she had witnessed to a lawyer referred to her by a friend. He either didn't believe it or simply didn't care. Either way, no action was taken, and it left Terry disillusioned with the legal system. During her time in Salt Lake City, Theresa started using her maiden name, Cross. She was hired to work as a nurse and live-in caregiver for an ailing woman in her 70s. Theresa even converted to the Mormon Church as another effort to blend in. She would train for and work as a nurse's aide and became friends with a classmate who also worked in the field. All information she shared regarding her background and family life was fabricated. She said she had a son in California, the only story she told that had its basis in truth. And of course, she didn't mention her 3 daughters. June 25, 1993. Robert Knorr Jr. was charged with second-degree murder after holding up a bartender and killing him. Police tried to contact his mother while he was being booked, but she was unreachable. The person who instructed him in the malicious art of domestic violence and oversaw his apprenticeship as an executioner was not available when he needed her most. He was sentenced to 16 years in prison. Though Theresa's treatment of the aged invalid Alice Powell was invariably exemplary for months, eventually her performance became subpar. She would take time off with little to no notice, sometimes disappearing for weeks with no explanation. Supposedly, she even began to abuse and neglect Alice. To quote Theresa's replacement, Anne Christopherson, "I think she was sometimes physical with Alice. I have no doubt that she slapped her a few times and used to leave her a few times and used to leave her on the toilet for hours. When I arrived here, I had to spend months getting Alice's confidence because she was so scared every time she had to be taken to the toilet. Terry met a man at a bar, and at least for him, it was love at first sight. They would go on to get married and move to Salt Lake City. She had no idea that her mother lived and worked there. Hopefully, the two would not cross paths, which would have undermined Terry's happily ever after. It didn't end that way anyhow. She and her husband Mike lived in an apartment that was partitioned from his parents' house. His family drank frequently and heavily. It led to many heated arguments, and Terry would often act as peacemaker. One night, she got into a fight with Mike and struck him. He pressed charges, and she was booked for assault. There were other such incidents. Even she grew up to emulate her violently abusive mother, despite being a victim. Appalled that her mother's propensity for violence had emerged in her own temperament, she decided the best counteraction was to report her mother's actions to the authorities. After all, no one else took her allegations seriously. And that concludes part 1 of the story of the life and crimes of Theresa Knorr. Make sure to listen to the conclusion next week. Thank you for listening to Human Monsters. Bye for now.